I think it was last week, maybe the week before, a gentleman in the congregation asked me words to this effect. He says, have you ever gotten up there and just kind of wondered if what you were hearing was actually from God? And I said, every Shabbat. every time I get up here. And I only point that out because today is one of those days I'm like, okay, I'm going to share some things, and I really do trust it's from the Lord, and that it is going to resonate in the hearts and lives of many of you. Hopefully, the Lord will speak to you in a way that you need to hear today. So I guess I should say that going in, and we'll find out at the end, right? All right, Genesis chapter 18 begins our Torah portion, Vayera, verse 1. Of course, this goes all the way over to the end of chapter 22. Then the Lord appeared, Vayera. The Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. And so he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. That to me struck me this morning as just kind of an interesting phrase that I really hadn't noticed before. He goes on, please let a little water be brought and wash your feet. And that's how we know that Abraham was a really humble man, because he's going to wash their feet. And rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. And after that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. And they said, do as you have said. So it is my understanding that this event occurred just days after Abraham and his entire household had, the male portion of his household were circumcised. And so not to go into too much detail about that, but I can imagine that they were just kind of laying around, a little bit immobilized, temporarily, of course. But let's just say that I don't picture them as just running around being very active right now when all this is happening. And so it's in this kind of a situation where he's temporarily immobilized. It's kind of a down period for a few days, who knows how long. But that's the scenario that God showed up in. My point is that when God has showed up in my life, this is not, what I'm going to say is not an exclusive statement, but there have been many times in my life that was a down period, and that's when God showed up. And I wasn't really expecting it. Can anybody, does that resonate with anybody? It's just like you're, okay, we've gotten past this little situation. God told me to do this. I did this. I'm not really feeling, so great about the after effects, but okay. And you're just kind of down and, just kind of, immobilized, not really going anywhere. And then all of a sudden you look out and there's God standing there to meet you. That just really impressed me this morning. He shows up a lot of times when we least expect him to show up. And the flip side of that is sometimes when we're expecting him to show up, he doesn't show up the way we expected him to. All right, but that's another sermon for another day. So it's this scenario in which God shows up, and it's with some important news. So then we see, rather than waiting for them to come to him, in fact, it even seems, by what he says, that maybe it looked as if they were just going to pass on by. But rather than allowing that to happen, what do we see? He's in a very big hurry to go and to greet them. He's not content to wait and to see if they're going to actually come to him. He runs to them. And so I was just, as I was reading this morning, just wondering, I'm thinking out loud right now. Is it possible that there for a moment it might have been that they would have just passed by if Abraham had not run to greet them? So in this chapter, it's typical for us and understandable that we'll focus on Abraham's kindness to others. We will emphasize Abraham's generosity and his hospitality and how he is with strangers, greeting them, come on in, get rest, I'll feed you, all of those things. By the way, traits that all of us should emulate. We should not look at strangers as if, we should not look at strangers as being strange necessarily, right? Because we were once strangers in Egypt, we were reminded again and again and again and again. And that's something, quite honestly, I have to work on. But anyway, he exhibits all these traits that we should emulate. We should consider ourselves first to be a servant, someone who's willing to humble themselves before, sometimes strangers, people we don't know. But I want to suggest to you there might be something else here that's not so obvious. Another trait of Abraham that perhaps we need to consider, and that is this. He did not risk these men passing by his tent. And that proved to be for him consequential. So then my question that, in my mind this morning as I'm rereading this, if they were there and he ran to greet them and invite them in, is it possible that maybe had he not done that, they would have passed by? I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. I'm just kind of putting the question out there. In other words, was Abraham being presented with an opportunity to demonstrate a proper response? Is it possible that God sometimes presents us with situations to see how we are going to respond to those situations? And to that, I would say absolutely, definitely, yes. Okay? He led Israel through the wilderness all those years and fed them with bread that your fathers didn't know, you didn't know. And why did he do this? To prove you, to see if it was really in your heart to keep my commandments or not. And so he will present opportunities whereby he's going to see what we do. Now, we can make the argument, God knows everything. He knows. Yet God verifies. He verifies things. So then, again, and I'm just posing it as a question, not making a declaration that this is absolutely certain, but was Abraham being presented with an opportunity to demonstrate how he was going to respond, to demonstrate a proper response? In other words, what if he had not ran to them? Hello? Hello? They're over there. Is it a timer for me, or is it, no, I'm just, now they're embarrassed and will never come back. No, I was just playing with you. Okay. Was Abraham being presented with an opportunity to see how he was going to respond? And again, what if he had not ran to them? What if he had not offered that hospitality? So while we're thinking in that way, I want to read a passage to you from Hebrews, one that you're very familiar with. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Let brotherly love continue. Let Philadelphia continue. We've talked about Philadelphia a lot around here, and we will continue to do that. But then he goes on and he says this, do not forget to entertain strangers. For by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. And I've never really connected those two verses, or these verses here in Hebrews, to what I was reading, what we read in Genesis 18. Perhaps you have. I never have. It just never dawned on me. Again, so let brotherly love continue. Well, we all know what brotherly love means. You love your neighbor as yourself. You prefer someone else over yourself, which is comes so natural to us to do. But the writer of Hebrews goes on and adds another layer to it, because sometimes you may, without realizing it, be entertaining angels. Now, if that weren't possible or weren't so, I don't think the writer of Hebrews would have said that. But what's the flip side? If we don't learn how to be as Abraham and be humble and generous, display hospitality, if we are not keen to do that in certain situations, we may miss opportunities to entertain angels unwittingly. And if we miss that opportunity, what kind of consequence, if any, what kind of consequence might that mean? This was heavy on my mind this morning. So it seems to me that there are moments when God presents opportunities to us whereby it is critical that we not only display kindness and hospitality and consideration, but would also suggest that there are opportunities that are presented to us that require us or challenge us, maybe that's the better way to put it, to be discerning of the situation. Now, I'm going to share an example of what I mean by this that is far removed from what we read here in the Bible, but in my mind anyway, it kind of underscores the point. So we're going to go to history class for just a moment, all right? I want to tell you about a very significant battle that happened in August of 1776. It's called the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. How many of you are familiar with that battle? That's what I thought. Okay. Let me enlighten you. This happened in August 1776, and the reason you know about it, anyway, he's not going to admit it. Anyway, this is the first major battle to take place after the United States had declared independence on July 4th, 1776, technically July 2nd. But this is the first major battle. George Washington was in command of the Continental Army, and he was positioned on Long Island in Brooklyn, what is now Brooklyn, to kind of meet the British threat as it was landing on Long Island. To make a very long story short, the Continental Army was whipped. They were soundly defeated, and they were forced to retreat toward the shore, toward the East River. In fact, they almost faced annihilation. So I'm not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of this, but one of the things that comes out of this is it demonstrated, at least on one hand, that George Washington was not a great tactician. He wasn't. Of the major battles that he commanded, he lost about half of them, 50%, all right? This was one of them. He made some pretty big mistakes. Of course, he was outnumbered, but he was also outmaneuvered. And losing this battle, or at least for a moment it seemed, that in losing this battle, it might have been his last battle. Because the Continental Army on that night, as sunset, they were facing annihilation because they were completely outnumbered. And so they were just, as sunset that night, they were waiting for the next morning when the British would come in and just overrun them. But if Washington was not a great tactician, he was a good strategist. And I say that because Washington was one of those guys, he could get the big picture. He could see the bigger picture here. And I want to suggest to you that in addition to that, he was very discerning of opportunities as they were presented to him. Because here's what's happened. Having been forced to retreat toward the East River, as I said, the Continental Army braced that evening for the assault that would be inevitable the next morning, where they would expect to be overwhelmed and pretty much annihilated. That was going to happen in just a matter of hours. However, as the sun was setting, this is recorded in history, as night fell, a very thick fog settled on the Continental Army and the British Army, so that one could not see the other. And so when this happened, Washington called on some of the men that were in his army, guys from Gloucester, Mass, and from Marblehead, and all these guys that knew boats and fishing and all those kinds of things. And they went all along the shore and gathered as many boats as they could find, very quietly, nobody talking, everything's muffled. They got guys on the front line, campfires going, making it look like everything's as it was. But all the while, they're gathering these boats. And when they get these boats gathered, they start shipping men across the East River under the cover of this fog. And by the way, had to pass several British men of war, these big ships, who for some reason did not detect them. Now, a lot of people say it was providential, that it was a miracle, that God orchestrated this. I kind of believe that. And the next morning, as the sun began to come up, and the fog began to lift, and the British went to overrun the Continental Army, when they got there, nobody was there. Every last man had made it across the East River to live to fight another day. The last boat carried George Washington and a few of his officers. Now, here's my point. What if Washington had just given in to the situation and said, this is what it is, it's just going to be what it's going to be, and had not seen that little bit of a change in circumstance and had decided to take advantage of this slim little window of opportunity that was offered to him. Now, some people call the Battle of Brooklyn Heights the Dunkirk of the American Revolution. Because if this miraculous escape had not occurred, then we could make the argument that the revolution would have ended there and then. Again, some people believe that this fog was providential and God just gave them favor. I believe that. But even though God presented them this opportunity, if you believe that with me, even though God presented this opportunity, Washington and his men still had to respond to it. I hate to use the term take advantage of it, but you understand what I'm trying to say. When they realized that, or when he realized that, he discerned that we have an opportunity here. He made the most of that opportunity. And so then, I'm just wanting to suggest to you that there are times, have been or will be, times when God presents us an opportunity that he's going to see how we're going to respond to it. Are we going to do the right thing? Are we discerning enough of things to see that God may be presenting us an opportunity? Now, where Abraham is concerned, it might be that the Lord was not intending to pass on by. It might be that he was determined that he was going to go visit Abraham that day and he was going to deliver the message that he could. Still, I think that we can glean something from how he responded to the situation. He didn't wait to see if these men were going to pass on by. He went to them. He seized the opportunity to run to them, invited them into his tent, and you know the rest of that story. And so there might be times when a door of opportunity is opened to God's people for just a moment. How important then is it that we are at the right place, at the right time, right spirit, discerning of these things? It's important that we're able to discern these situations. And then once discerning it, to respond to it. Now, there are times when God is just merciful to us. And not only does he present us an opportunity, but he leads us to it. And sometimes he actually grabs us by the hand and pulls us toward it. Case in point, Genesis 19, verse 15. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city." And while he lingered, all right, let's just pause and think about that for just a second. 2 angels show up at your door. You know they're angels because they blinded all of the homosexuals that were trying to beat down the door. Okay? I'll move on. We're going to destroy this city. God's going to overthrow it. It's a stench to God. He's going to get rid of it. You need to get out of here before that happens. And I decide, it might be a good time to just hang around and take my time. I would like to think that if 2 angels showed up at my house and said, "Get out of this place, God's about to destroy it," I'd be like, "Okay, let's go. We're out of here." If you're going with me, you better move fast because I'm out of here. All right. He lingered. So much so that the men took hold of his hand. They grabbed him by the hand, his wife's hand, and the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. The Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. They had to lead Lot and his family outside of the city. That just blows my mind for some reason. And then I start thinking about me. And I think about some of the times that God has just had to jar me and take me by the hand. And thankfully, just showing mercy and demonstrating mercy to me, bring me into a situation. Now, you don't have to raise your hand, but has that ever happened in your life? All right. And so it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." Now, for the record, let me say again, reemphasize, God was merciful to him. God was merciful to his family. Wouldn't do anything until Lot got away. However, I do not think this is the best example of how to properly respond to an opportunity when God gives you one. In other words, I would rather be discerning and be appropriately responsive to any opportunity that God gives me rather than kind of, and he has to take me by the hand and drag me to it. For Lot and his family, I'm sure they were very grateful. But my point is, this isn't the greatest example. This is not the example that I want to follow in these kinds of situations. You understand what I'm trying to say here? Okay. By not only that, but I remain convinced that Lot's deliverance actually was because of Abraham. And I think that's why God was really merciful to him, because he was considering his friend Abraham and the prayer and the intercession. Because when Lot gets outside of the city, now he's had to be dragged outside the city, keep in mind. And so when he gets out of the city and they're telling him you need to flee to the mountains, he said, I don't think we can do that. If I thought that that city was going to be destroyed with fire and brimstone, I bet you I could make that mountain. I bet you I could get there. All right? But he's like, we can't get there. Let us go to this other city. You know the story. He's arguing with the angels about where to go after all of this. Okay? But still, and the point was, there are times in our lives when God shoves us into a situation that is for our good. And I am grateful and thankful that in his mercy, he has done that in my life from time to time. But Lot's example is not presented to you and me in the scripture as one to emulate. Abraham is. Right? Now, there are other examples when God not only presents an opportunity to us, but he has to open our eyes in order to see it. So, you know the story in the Torah portion, Isaac's being weaned, Ishmael is making sport, he's laughing. Sarah sees this, she goes to Abraham and says, that woman over there, that Egyptian woman, and her son have to go. And you know the story. So Genesis 21, verse 14. Then she departed, that is Hagar, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water skin was used up, and she placed the boy, Ishmael, under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. And then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? All right, do you think God knows what's going on? What's your problem? He knows what the problem is. Again, he gives us opportunity to respond, to see what's going on in our heart, or to verify what's going on in our heart. What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and that's what we wanted to emphasize here. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the lad a drink. And so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. So there are situations in our life wherein we are tempted to lose hope, as Hagar did. And God has had to open our eyes to see the salvation that was right in front of us. Sometimes we can get too focused on our circumstance, and I'm guilty of this. We can get so focused on our circumstance that we cannot see what God is providing right in front of us. And in his mercy, he opens our eyes to see it. And I'm very thankful for that as well. Now, it could be that God was merciful to Hagar simply because she was a woman in distress, because she was desperate. But we should not dismiss the fact that God, just previous to what we read, had told Abraham, don't be worried about Ishmael. I am going to make a great nation of him for your sake. Because he's your son, I'm going to bless him. So he's keeping that promise, once again, to Abraham and others' benefit. But sometimes God has to open our eyes to the way of escape, the salvation, the thing that brings us hope. It was right there all the time, but we're so focused on our circumstance, we cannot see it, would not see it, refuse to see it, whatever the case may be. And he has to open our eyes for us to see it. So that's a great story. However, once again, just like it was with Lot, Hagar, Ishmael, and their lives are not presented to us as examples that we are to follow. Not Ishmael, not Hagar, not Lot, Abraham. Because Abraham was a man of faith, and that is an understatement. And Abraham is set apart as one we are to emulate. If we are in Messiah, if we are people of faith, then we are regarded as the seed of Abraham and the heirs according to the promise. And as Messiah said, if you are the children of Abraham, you will do the works of Abraham. We will emulate those things, those characteristics, those traits. And what I'm suggesting is that beyond the hospitality, beyond the believing, beyond those things, perhaps this was also a man who very quickly seized an opportunity when he saw it, in that he was discerning that God was doing something. And again, remember, in our Torah portion, God shows up in a time when he and his household are a weakened state. We'll just put it that way. I think we sang this line this morning, when my strength is gone, you will carry me. I'm very thankful for that promise. That when my strength is gone, you will carry us. And in a sense, that's what's happening here. So, again, being the seed of Abraham, there are attributes, characteristics that you and I need to demonstrate in our lives. Hospitality, service, faith, all of these different things. But I'm also going to suggest to you, perhaps we should also strive to emulate this ability to discern a situation and to know when and how to act accordingly. Now let's go back to the tent and what was going on there. He's asked these men to come in. He's having food prepared for them. By the way, and this is not what I want to get into right now, but I would like for somebody to help me out sometime down the road. How do you slaughter a calf, get it prepared, cook it all in one afternoon? I want somebody to explain that to me later. Okay, not right now. All right, but anyway, so he's prepared a meal for them. He brought them into his tent. They're resting there. And then they ask, where's Sarah? All right, so here's my point. If there had been any doubt about who was visiting him, that should have concluded the matter. Where's Sarah? And he doesn't say, how do you know that? He just goes, she's in the tent. All right? So that kind of, I know that I'm not just dealing with three strangers walking down the road now. And so beyond that, he's displaying this hospitality, his willingness to serve them, even before himself. And now all this has transpired. There is a promise that he received a long time ago, that this is the moment, this is the setting, that promise is now reaffirmed. And not just reaffirmed, he is told exactly when it's going to take place. Boy, wouldn't we like to know that. How many of us would like to know the exact moment he is going to visit us, and that promise that I made you years ago, it's going to come to pass within a year. At this time next year is going to happen. Would anybody like for that to happen in their life? Everybody's hand goes up, right? Okay. Well, look at what had to happen to kind of set the stage for that. Interesting. So let's go Genesis 18, verse 10. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Now, Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. I think he knew that. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore, Sarah laughed. Vayitzak, which is where we get the name Isaac. She laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, not to Sarah, but to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is there anything too hard or too wonderful? That word can mean wonderful for the Lord. At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. Okay. I think Beth may have something to say about that later. I don't know. Sarah's hesitancy, probably, is because she realized that what he was talking about would require a miracle of miracles. It would be a miracle on the level of being akin to resurrection from the dead. In fact, I think it's the writer of Hebrews says that this promise was given to Abraham and to Sarah, and he was as good as dead. I think that's the way it's worded. So it would be on that level, a miracle that would be equivalent or synonymous with resurrection from the dead. However, that's exactly the way God orchestrated it, because it had to be that way. It's the only way for the promised seed to fulfill God's purposes, because when it happens, there is no way that people are going to say that people in their own strength did this. This is the hand of God. When Miriam or Mary learned that she was to give birth to a child and just who this child was, she says, how can this be? Because she was still a virgin. But the promises that God makes in relation to his redemption, the redemption of his people, the salvation of his people, always has to come through miraculous circumstance, and so that there will be no one who can deny the source of this miracle. Again, is there anything too wonderful, too hard for the Lord? And the answer to that question is what? No, there isn't. There isn't. And I want to go back to something we said earlier. If that is true, then let's remember that, and I'm speaking to myself too. Let's remember that there's nothing too hard for the Lord, even when we feel like Hagar and feel like we've been abandoned and we're kind of out to drift, and we're just waiting for the end to come. The answer might be right in front of us. He just has to open our eyes to it. May he do that. So, we read these things and we study these things because we understand that in some form or fashion, we're going to be presented with these same kinds of scenarios or similar scenarios, which then would also mean that we are going to be presented with opportunities as they were that will require the same thing of us. And I'm going to, kind of focus in on Abraham here, not Hagar, not Lot, because I want us to be the kind of people that follow his example. To believe for what seems impossible, to hang on even though it seems like time is getting away from us, that time is not on our side, to believe for it anyway. And then connect to that, there is this need for us to be able to discern what is going on around us. What is the Lord doing? To discern these things, to discern these opportune encounters. Sometimes we meet people for reasons that then and there don't really jump out and grab us. Only later on do we realize how important that maybe brief encounter was. I've shared this in times past, but I'll share it again. 2001, 2, somewhere in there. Those are the days I was still speaking in a lot of churches and things, and I was still wearing ties. I hadn't worn one in a long time, so don't get any ideas. But I was still wearing ties and sports coats and all these kinds of things. And I was invited to a conference down in Central Florida in the Tampa area by a group of people. I was not really familiar with them. And somebody called me up when they learned that I had been invited, and they said, if you go to that particular conference, we're not going to be able to have you at our congregation anymore, which to me was like throwing the gauntlet down. I'm like, okay, let's go see what this is all about, So I went and I showed up in my sports jacket and my tie and all this kind of stuff. And I met some people that, have become very good friends through the years. And it was a very consequential meeting, but not for why I thought. I was invited to go to a particular Sukkot gathering that year. And so I went, and when I got to that Sukkot gathering, there was this little short dude, he walked around like this, and these kinds of things. Some of you know who I'm talking about. But it just changed a lot of things in my life. And it was extremely important that encounter happened. And I'm just, as I thought back over it, just how one little thing had been tweaked a little bit differently. If I had not, I want to put it this way, seized the opportunity, perhaps out of bullheadedness, but nevertheless, if I had not seized the opportunity, it was presented to me, that could have changed everything. So we have to be discerning about these, what might seem on the surface to be chance encounters. Sometimes when we are entertaining strangers, the writer of Hebrews says, you may be entertaining angels unwittingly. you might be in a situation that has the potential to change certain things in your life. We sang this morning, step by step, you will lead me. But it's very important for us as he presents those steps before us that we take those steps. Amen? All right. So then, again, all of those wonderful characteristics and attributes that we see in Abraham. Let's add to that his ability to see an opportunity. He doesn't want it to pass him by. So rather than risking it passing him by, he runs and says, come into the tent. Now, is it wrong for us to believe for the impossible when the circumstances say otherwise? Of course not. And yet we do. But it is not wrong for us to believe for the impossible. It takes a lot of effort sometimes to believe for those kinds of things because of the circumstances. It's just a lot easier to sit back and accept things the way they are. Whether you're Lot, whether you're Hagar, it's just becomes a lot easier for us to accept things as they appear to be. But again, there is nothing impossible with God. There's nothing too hard for God. There's nothing too wonderful for God. Remember, to the father of the boy who had this unclean spirit, and he come to Yeshua about it, here's what Yeshua said to that man in Mark chapter 9, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. You remember how the man replied? Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. All right, I believe, but help my unbelief. Here's how I interpret that for me. There are things it is very easy for me to believe God for. And then there are things it is really hard for me to believe God for. And so the things that he wants to work on in my life are not the things that it's easy for me to believe him for. Imagine that. It's the things it's very hard for me to believe him for. Things that we have no problem believing compared to those things we struggle to believe. In an assembly like this, we're going to have people that it's going to be easy for them to believe for this, and those same people, difficult for them to believe for that. But in an assembly, we'll have people who it's easy for them to believe for this, and it might be difficult to believe for that. And guess what? When they come together, things can happen, right? When these come together, things can happen. If two of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Maybe that is to infer that we need two or more to gather because this guy can believe for this and this guy can believe for that. And when we come together in his name and all that faith is there, things can start to happen. Remember, we said this because soon we'll come back to this. Not today necessarily, but we're going to come back to that issue right there. So, we need to unite our faith to believe for the impossible. We used to sing a song. Well, some of us still do. All things are possible if only you believe. Now, does that mean that we should believe for all the things that we want? Or should we believe for those things that are his will? Okay. Obviously, we want to pray his will. But our actions or our inaction can be a determining factor in all of this. There are a lot of things that we see in the scripture that God willed, but he left it to his servants to carry out his will. And we could presume that if they had not done what he asked them to do, then the outcome may have been different. Of course, God is God, and his purpose is always going to win out over you, me, and what we want. He's going to get his way. But I guess what I want to read into this or glean from this is I would rather him get his way with me being part of it rather than him having to find somebody else. All right? Y'all agree with that? Okay. We also need to consider this. In Mark chapter 14, Yeshua prayed, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. So that verse provokes me to say this. When it is obvious as to what the Father's will is, then you and I must come into agreement with it. Let me say that again, because I only got one amen. When we know what the Father's will is, it is for us to come into agreement with his will, regardless of what our will may be. Now, going back to Abraham, where he was concerned, God's will was that Abraham was to have a son. And the son was a promise to Abraham, but not only to Abraham, it was a promise to the world as it relates to God's plan, because in you and your seed, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so Isaac is that promised seed. But for that plan to come to pass, for Isaac, the promised seed, to come into the world, there had to be a willing vessel. There had to be someone who would believe God. There had to be someone who would be willing to go every step that God set before him, because the steps of a good man are ordered of God, right? By the way, that word good, better rendered strong. Steps of a strong man. Not using that term with a negative connotation, but with a positive connotation. The steps of a strong man are ordered of God. And if that is the way it's to be understood, then what's the flip side of that? He doesn't want some weakling, right? He doesn't want someone who's just going to give up the first sign of trouble. Now, he will bring us from the point of being weak, and in him we can become strong. But do you understand what I'm trying to say? Someone who is willing to take those steps, to go to a land that I will show you, and there I'll make you a great nation. And he goes there not knowing where he's going, but he believed God, and it was accounted unto him as righteousness. So it's very, very important for us to be those kinds of people. And that's what he had to find. That's the person he chose. That's the kind of people he chose when he chose Abraham. And on down the line. So now let's look at this. Being chosen of the Lord as Abraham was, being willing to be a faithful servant as Abraham was, and to be one who believes God. All of those things are very important, and for so many reasons. And Abraham's life attests to the importance of being willing to be faithful, believing God, being chosen of the Lord. But one of the benefits that might not be so obvious to us, one that I think is very important, is when you're that kind of a person, God says to himself, you know what, I'm not going to hide from him what I'm about to do. Genesis 18, verse 17, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I have known him. I have known him. I have known him. We've had this relationship. We've had this interaction with one another. For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. So I think it's very powerful to see that the creator of the universe, who owes no one anything, determines within himself that what he is about to do, because of his relationship with Abraham, he determines that I'm not going to keep this thing from him. I am going to let him know. And we could, discuss and even debate, what all that entails, and, the conversation and probably not the best word, bartering, that Abraham's trying to do. That maybe that was one of the reasons that he tells him this. But nonetheless, this is what I want to emphasize for the moment. He said, I'm not going to keep this from Abraham because I've known him, which is to say, I've had an intimate relationship with him. And because he's known him, because he knows him, he also knows what he can entrust to him. If he knows us, then he knows what he can entrust to us, what he can trust us with. And the flip side of that is what he can't trust us with. Sometimes, and this is a message we've given in times past, I do believe that he sometimes gives Judas the purse to see what is Judas going to do with the purse. I don't believe he gave him the purse to set him up to fail. I believe he gave him the purse to see what you're going to do. Because I know you have that weakness, and you need to be stronger than that. We know the outcome of that. So if he knows us, if he has known us, then he knows what he can entrust to us, what he can't trust us with. And he knew that he could trust Abraham because Abraham was someone that was not only going to follow him, but was going to teach his children to follow God and the ways of God. He was going to propagate this from generation to generation. And there is no greater gift a father can give to his children than to instruct them, and not just verbally, but by example in the ways of righteousness, complete with our weaknesses and times of, falling short. Nevertheless, that is one of the greatest things that we can give to our children as fathers and mothers, grandparents and great-grandparents. And so God knew this about Abraham. He knew it. He knew he would do these things. And that's one of the reasons that he was chosen. That's one of the reasons he was chosen. And not only that, it's one of the reasons that he said, I'm not going to hide this thing I'm about to do from Abraham. I can entrust him with this. Now, does that mean that Abraham was a perfect man? Of course, it does not. This Torah portion before, going all the way, back to Lech Lecha, when we see Abraham introduced to us, we see that Abraham was not a perfect man. There are some decisions he made that I think weren't the best of decisions. And we have a repeat of that in this Torah portion. She's my sister. And in saying she's my sister and her saying he's my brother, that put Abimelech and all of his people in jeopardy. And that's why the king says, what have you done to us? Why did you do this to me? He put him in a bad situation. God told him in a dream, touch her, I kill you. That's what he said. I hadn't touched her. I didn't know. Well, no, you didn't know. Still, touch her, I kill you. So Abimelech says, why did you do this? All right, my point is he's not a perfect or wasn't a perfect man. However, Abraham is that guy that God puts out there for us to see. This is someone that on this journey he has perfected and is perfecting. And as the seed of Abraham, that's something we need to just continue to remind ourselves. We're not perfect. He's not perfect. She's not perfect, but we are being perfected. If we follow the steps that he has put before us, we are being perfected. And in that perfecting process, I dare say that there are going to be times that we blow it. We just mess up. We make mistakes. We fall flat. But I'm not encouraging anybody to, I'm just going to make a mistake, so, I'm not going to worry about it. That's not what I'm saying. But there is value in learning from those experiences. If nothing else, knowing what not to do. Now, it's pretty stupid if you know what not to do, and then you go do it again. That's just stupid. But anyway, I know some people don't like me using that word. Brielle doesn't like it. Yeah, okay, well, I have to find a new word. Let me think. Idiot. There we go. You're just an idiot. All right. Again, there's none of us here perfect. We all know that. And let's remember that with our brothers and sisters. Let's bear along with one another. And that's, again, something that it doesn't come natural to us, but it is something that, if we're going to emulate the works of our father Abraham, these are things that we need to learn to do. All right, now, let us consider ourselves in this scenario. God knows us. If you've been walking any length of time in this faith, God's learned a lot about you. Would you say? And you've learned a lot about yourself during this time. Same with me. All right? So that being understood, have we demonstrated that we can be trusted? Have we demonstrated that we can be trusted with our children? Have we demonstrated that we can be trusted with our fellow servants? Have we demonstrated that we truly are committed to his ways? Now, when I say that, you need to consider is not just what we do, it's how we do it. That we truly are able to demonstrate if we're committed to his ways. Seeing that God knows us, can he trust us with his people? Because, some are going to be, over this number, some over this number, some over this number in the kingdom. And I would dare say that how that turns out is going to probably be somewhat tied to how we dealt with his people in this life. So how much can he trust us with his people? Are the people there to be served by us, or are the people there to serve us? Can we be trusted with his people? If he knows us, then he's probably wanting to verify whether or not you and I are committed to being continually perfected. Because, Abram leaves Ur and then he goes into Canaan, but he has to go to Egypt. We know the story there. He leaves with Hagar. That leads to other complications. He has to split off from Lot and all that, that entailed. And, there's all of these things that are being presented to him where we see that, we read it in a few chapters, but this is spread out over years where the man is being continually perfected, but he doesn't give up. He doesn't turn back. He doesn't quit. He keeps going to the ultimate challenge, and that's presented to us at the end of this Torah portion, which we're not going to get into too much of that today. We've talked about that a lot. But the point was he was willing to be continually perfected. And so I believe that comes into play, all these things that we're asking, that comes into play with whether or not he can entrust certain things to us as it relates to the future. I'm not going to keep this thing from Abraham. I know this guy. How well? Well, he knows us, but what have we demonstrated to him? To the point that I know that I can entrust this to Joe or to Sue or to whatever your name is. It might have bearing on how much he reveals to us about what is to come. That is, I know them, I know what I can trust them with, etc. Everybody in this room wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen next week and that year and all this. Everybody wants to know at least what the next step is, including yours truly. I want to know what the next step is. But I want to consider this as well, and I'm talking to myself. Perhaps it's important for us who want to know what the next step is to first demonstrate that we're going to be faithful to take it. Where does our faithfulness, or what does he see in us in regards to our faithfulness? Faithful to be diligent in the little things. Everybody wants to, get in on the big things. But how faithful are we in the little things? The things that people don't notice, things that people will never know about. But all of that is part of the perfecting process. So then, how wonderful would it be to have something happen and to realize that this is evidence that God is still working with me, working to perfect me, and we're making progress here. I mean, that gives me encouragement, right? To think that there's progress being made. It would be a great thing to see some kind of demonstration, some kind of evidence to know that the Almighty is still there, still cares about me, still interested in our relationship. We have a very good relationship. That would be wonderful. So in that light, I want you to consider this. In Genesis 19, verse 27. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham. And we all know what that means, right? To remember Abraham is to act on his behalf. He acted on behalf of Abraham. And this is how he acted on Abraham's behalf. And sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. So Abraham goes out to the place where he had been speaking to the Lord and engaging him in this conversation. If there are 50, if there are 45, if there are 40, all the way down to 10. And my calculations are that with Lot, his wife, his unmarried daughters, and he had at least 2 sons-in-law, the way I read it. So that means that at best, in Lot's family, there were probably 8. And how do we know that? Well, because there certainly weren't 10. How do we know that? Because he overthrew the city. So it was definitely less than 10, probably no more than 8. All right? So he goes out, and Abraham realizes, well, there weren't 10. Pretty obvious, right? So he's looking at this, and he's seeing the smoke rising as a furnace. And I have to think that he was probably thinking about his nephew. But at the same time, knowing God the way he knew him, I have to believe that he was at peace about that. I have to believe that. Now, I want you to also consider this. In that moment, when he saw that smoke rising like a furnace, in that moment, he knew that when he and Lot had to separate, he, Abraham, made the right decision. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. He let Lot choose. He made the right decision. I guess maybe that doesn't impress you the way it impressed me as I was reading this morning, but man, it is a comfort to know, because sometimes you just don't know. You take a step of faith and you're hoping that there's something solid there. And even then, sometimes I'm still waiting on some kind of a validation or confirmation that, I'm standing in the right place. And so, man, I can't tell you, well, I'm sure I can. You understand what it means that when you've taken a step of faith to see God do something. And I know in this particular case, he's overthrown the cities of the plain. People are consumed. This wickedness is destroyed, and that smoke is going up like a furnace. Bad for them. But I made the right decision. I think there's value in that. He let somebody else make the choice, which was, for Abraham, the right choice. And so then, somehow, we might want to consider that sometimes when we show consideration for others, as he showed Lot in this particular situation, when we show consideration for others, when we defer to others and we prefer others over ourselves, what might at the moment be an act of humility, of selflessness, and all those kinds of things, might turn out to be the means of salvation and deliverance for you. Something to think about. Oh, just a footnote. Do you think God knew what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah before he visited Abraham in the tent? He probably knew what was going on. But notice, he's going to go and check it out and verify it for himself. Even when we are absolutely certain of something, it's always a good thing to verify it, to validate it. Just if the creator of the universe does that, it might be something good for us to practice. All right, but that's just a kind of an aside. So we're going to kind of wrap it up here. Through Abraham's example, we find inspiration to believe for the impossible. And in his life, we see that while we're waiting on that he is perfecting us through this process. And when we are walking in his purpose, the impossible can and will happen. Sarah was 90. Abraham was 100. As the writer of Hebrews said, as good as dead. And yet, God fulfilled that promise that he made to them about the promised son. And so again, some promises are going to be fulfilled in such a way that when it happens, no man will be able to take the credit. Everybody will stand back and say, this is the hand of God. In Abraham's example, we also see how important it is, at least this is what I'm taking away from this Torah portion today, how important it is to be willing to respond appropriately to situations, to be discerning of our surroundings, these opportunities that God presents to us. Perhaps because he does that to see what we're going to do, to see what we will do, see what we won't do, perhaps, and to verify in us what seems to be there. In other words, going back to Deuteronomy 8, God led Israel through the wilderness to see if it was in their heart to keep his commandments or not. But now let me ask you, don't you think he knew what was in their heart? Right? But it was important for that to be verified. I mean, he is the true judge, the only judge. His justice cannot be questioned. And even he verifies things. In other words, he presents the evidence to us as well. Something very important for us to consider. He presents these opportunities to us to see what we're going to do, what we're not going to do. And I believe that's tied to the idea of what can he trust us with? What can he entrust to us? How dedicated are we to his will that he can entrust certain things to us, reveal certain things to us? I mean, there are some people who, well, I'll be careful how I say this. Some people get a revelation about something, and they feel that what I need to do now is write a book. And there's nothing wrong with writing a book. But I'm going to walk this tightrope here. It's not about the next, end thing. The revelation that God gives us is about propagating his purposes in the earth. Okay? So can he trust us with what he reveals to us? In other words, are we going to use it for his purposes, or are we going to use it for our own? For that matter, the gifts and the talents that he's given to each and every one of us, why did he give them to us? Can he trust us with those gifts and talents that he's given us? Are we going to use them for his purpose, or are we going to use it for our own gain? All that's part of the perfecting process, to see what's in there, to verify what's in there, to bring it to the surface. And when it comes to the surface and it's not so good, that's the time to deal with it and to make things right. So I believe that in these last days, God is looking for people that he can trust. I believe he's looking for those he can trust. He's looking for people that he can trust with his people. We know that we can always count on God. We sang song after song today, and we do it every week, about how we can count on God, how God is faithful to us, how God answers our prayer, how God keeps his promises to us. We know we can always count on God, but there is a question lingering as to, can God count on us? Now, the short answer to that is no, because we're going to fall short, we're going to fail, and he knows that. He knows we're flesh and all that. But you understand what I mean? Hopefully you understand what I mean. He is looking for people that he can count on to take that step and the next step and the next step, to be faithful, to be committed, to be determined, to be discerning, to be believing, all these things, so that we might fulfill his purpose in us, for us, and through us. And so here's my final thought. In the end of this Torah portion, we see that Abraham feared God more than anything else. And just as God would not keep that piece of information from Abraham in Genesis 18, in Genesis chapter 22, there is nothing that Abraham would keep from God. It's a reciprocal kind of a situation. God wouldn't keep anything from him. Abraham's not going to keep anything from God. And God verifies this. In fact, Genesis 22 begins, and it came time for God to, most translations say test, but the word is prove. If you will, verify. Something that he knew was there, but this has to be verified. And so he put him through one of the greatest tests that anybody could ever endure, short of what the Messiah went through. And in the end, he says, I know that you're a man that is not going to keep anything from me. That's through the binding of Isaac. And so when God had verified Abraham's unconditional commitment to follow, to believe, to obey, etc., he gave this promise to him in Genesis 22, verse 16. By myself I have sworn. Now, there's no one higher to swear by, right? By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. Well, that's been promised to him before, but now this is all being verified and validated, reaffirmed. And then he says this, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And so in the end, his seed, God says, because he can swear by no higher authority, that the seed of Abraham will possess the gates of their enemies. So each step we're presented with, if we take each step and we continue, eventually this takes us to the very gate of our enemy. Messiah said, and on this rock I'll build my congregation, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, right? So in the last days, he is looking for people that he can trust. I can do all things through the Messiah who strengthens me. But would you agree with me that it takes a willing vessel, someone who is willing to follow the Lord and obey the Lord and stay and be strong and stay committed to the faith? And if we do that, he says, we will possess the gates of our enemies. I believe that's the day we're living in. I believe the season is upon us. And, this is not a thus says the Lord. It's just what I feel in my gut. But I believe that if we're not in it, we're at the threshold of a season when God is going to humiliate the wicked. He's going to humble the proud. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying destroy. I'm saying humiliate and humble those that are in opposition to his will. And he's just going to soften up the enemy, in other words, so that you and I, who are committed to following him, can march all the way, metaphorically speaking anyway, to the gates of our enemy, to take those who have been captive, to release those from captivity that are held in bondage, to take this message and this gospel of the kingdom into places that we would have never thought possible. I believe that we're sitting at the threshold of that. You'll just have to judge that in your spirit. We know we can count on God, but the question today is, can God count on us to follow through with that? Not just in word, but in deed. Amen?